This time we're looking at April, and as always, we've got our stack of KVF.4 articles here ready to dig in.
Sounds good. Let's see what April had in store.
Yeah, what kind of news were they covering? What caught your eye?
Well, politically, it was a busy month. Right off the bat, the new government presented their budget on April 2nd.
Oh, right, yeah, I remember that. Big focus on infrastructure and green energy, right?
You got it. Lots of investments there. And just a few days later, Parliament passed a new fisheries law on the 5th.
Oh, wow, so that's pretty big news, right? Well, obviously for the fishing industry, but for the whole economy, really.
Absolutely. It's a major change to how fishing quotas are managed.
Interesting. And then, let's see, what else happened? Oh, yeah, on April 9th, there was that agreement with Greenland.
Yeah, that was interesting. They're strengthening ties in a bunch of areas.
Yeah.
Trade, education, even culture.
Cool. Lots of potential there.
Yeah.
But it wasn't all smooth sailing politically, right?
Well, on April 16th, there was a bit of a disagreement within the coalition government over a proposed immigration law.
Yeah, that's politics for you, I guess.
Yeah.
But hey, at least they opened that fancy new embassy in London on the 19th, right?
They did indeed. A nice diplomatic touch. Now, how about we shift gears a bit and look at the economic side of things?
Sounds good to me. What did we see in April?
Well, Bakkafrost, the big salmon farming company, they sold their Scottish operations on the 4th.
That's interesting. Wonder what was behind that decision.
It'll be interesting to see how it plays out. And speaking of interesting, on the 11th, they unveiled a new tourism strategy.
Oh, yeah, I remember reading something about that. Focusing on high-value visitors, I think they called it.
Right. They want to attract tourists who will stay longer, spend more, and really engage with what the Faroes have to offer.
Sounds like a good plan.
Mm.
And then on the 18th, the Chamber of Commerce was reporting strong economic growth.
Yeah, they seemed pretty happy about that. Things were looking up.
That's great to hear. Oh, and one more thing on the economy front. Atlantic Airways announced they're getting new planes on the 25th.
Yep. Definitely a sign that they're expecting growth in the travel sector.
Now let's move on to the cultural side of things.
Mm-hmm.
Always some interesting stuff happening there. What did we see in April?
Well, on the 3rd, a new book came out exploring the history of the Faroes language struggle.
Ah, that sounds fascinating.
It's a really interesting topic. And then, get this, on the 10th, the first Faroes feature film in 20 years premiered.
Wow, that's pretty big news, right, after all this time.
Definitely. A
Right.
big moment for Faroe cinema.
And then, of course, there was Culture Week in Vágar from the 17th to the 23rd.
Always a popular event.
Tons of music, exhibitions, workshops, all that good stuff. And speaking of music, a Faroes band actually went on a European tour starting on the 24th.
Yeah, they're getting their music out there. And then on the 29th, a new museum opened in Klaksvik, all about the fishing industry.
Oh, that makes sense. Fittingly, I guess, given its importance to the islands.
Definitely. Okay, so we've covered politics, the economy, culture. How about we look at some of the other news from April?
Yeah, good idea. What else was going on?
Well, there was some positive news on the health front. On the 8th, the National Hospital announced they were making progress in reducing waiting lists for certain procedures.
Oh, that's good to hear.
And then on the 15th, there was a new study released about the dietary habits of Faroes people.
Interesting. Always curious to hear about different cultures' diets.
Then on the 22nd, the government launched some new initiatives to tackle underage drinking.
Okay, makes sense. Important issue.
Absolutely. And then on the international front, Faroes representatives attended a global climate change conference on the 6th.
Good to see them participating in that. And on a related note, on the 20th, they designated a new protected area, preserving a really beautiful natural landscape.
Nice. Always good to see conservation efforts in action.
All right, so last but not least, let's round things out with some sports highlights from April.
Sounds good to me. What do we have?
Well, on the first, HB beat their rivals Key in a cup match.
Yeah, that's always a big game. Those two teams have a real rivalry going on.
And then on the 13th, we had a Faroes athlete winning a medal at an international competition.
That's awesome. Sadly, no details on who or what sport, but still a great achievement.
Definitely. The Faroes women's national football team, however, lost their Euros qualifier against Spain on the 27th.
Tough game, but I'm sure they gave it their all.
And finally, on the 28th, the National Swimming Championships were held, with several new records set.
Pretty impressive. Sounds like a lot of great athletic performances in April.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah, a lot going on across the board. Politics, the economy, culture, sports. April was definitely a busy month in the Faroes.
Yeah, it really was. And, thinking about all that, We could maybe dig a little deeper into a few of those stories, like that new fisheries law you mentioned.
Oh, yeah, good idea. What were the key changes there?
Well, it's a pretty big shift. It's moving away from that old quota
Mhm.
system, and instead, it's all about fishing rights now. Fishing rights. So what does that actually mean?
It's basically giving fishermen more long-term security, Instead of having to scramble for quotas every year, they have these rights that are more stable, and that's supposed to encourage them to fish more sustainably, too.
Oh, okay, I see. So it's kind of like owning a piece of the resource in a way.
Yeah, you could think of it like that. It's about giving them a stake in the long-term health of the fishery.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
And what about that new tourism strategy? I remember that caught my eye. High-value visitors, right?
Exactly. They're not just looking for any tourists, They want people who are going to stay longer, spend more money, and really experience what the Faroes have to offer.
So what kind of visitors are they hoping to attract?
Well, think about people who are into niche experiences. Bird watchers, hikers, photographers,
Yeah.
people who are willing to travel a bit off the beaten path.
Oh, right. Yeah. Not just your typical cruise ship crowd.
Exactly. They're looking for people who are genuinely interested in the Faroe Islands, not just checking it off a list.
And do you think those new planes for Atlantic Airways are part of that strategy?
Well, it's certainly possible. I mean, if they want to attract more of those high-value visitors, they need to make it easier to get here, right?
Yeah, that makes sense. More flights, maybe even new routes.
Exactly. And, it ties into their sustainability goals, too. More direct flights could mean less carbon emissions for those travelers.
Oh, yeah, that's a good point. I hadn't thought of that. Now, switching gears a bit here, let's talk about that new book on the Faroes language struggle. What's that all about?
Well, it's a fascinating story, really. It's about the efforts to preserve the Faroes language, which was actually suppressed for centuries under Danish rule.
Wow, really?
For
Yeah,
centuries.
it's a long history. But the Faroes people were really determined to keep their language alive, and this book explores all the different ways they did that.
That's incredible. It just shows you how important language is to a culture's identity.
Absolutely. And speaking of culture, what about that new Faroes film, huh? 20 years in the making. I know, right? It's amazing to think about. Like, a whole generation has grown up without seeing a Faroes film on the big screen.
Yeah, it's a pretty big deal, a real revival of Faroese cinema. I'm curious to see what kind of stories they're telling now.
Me too. And then, of course, we had Culture Week in Vagar, which is always a blast.
Yeah, it's such a great way to experience Faroese culture, all those concerts, exhibitions, workshops. It's just a vibrant celebration.
Totally. And, it's not just local anymore. That Faroes band touring Europe is taking their music to a whole new audience.
That's so cool. Music is such a universal language, It can really connect people from different cultures.
Yeah, I love that. Now, that new museum in Klaksvik, dedicated to the fishing industry, I thought that was really fitting.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, fishing is so deeply ingrained in Faroese history and culture. It only makes sense to have a museum celebrating that.
Totally. And with that new fisheries law we talked about, it feels like the industry is entering a new chapter.
Yeah, you could say that. Maybe the museum will even touch on that, how things are changing and evolving.
That'd be interesting to see. Now, let's shift gears again and talk about some of the other news from April. Starting with that positive development on the health front, with the National Hospital reducing waiting lists.
Yeah, that's always good news. Shorter wait times mean people can get the care they need more quickly.
Exactly. And what about that study on Faroes diets? Did anything interesting come out of that?
I'm actually curious about that myself. I haven't had a chance to dive into the details yet.
Well, maybe that's something we can look into for a future deep dive.
Yeah, good idea. Now, those initiatives to tackle underage drinking, that's definitely important.
Yeah, it's a serious issue, and it's good to see them taking steps to address it.
And speaking of taking steps, it was good to see Faroe's representatives at that global climate change conference.
Yeah, shows they're engaged with those global issues. And then creating that new protected area that's great for conservation.
Absolutely. Those natural landscapes are so precious. It's important to protect them.
All right, so last but not least, let's talk about some of the sports highlights from April.
Sounds good. What did we see?
Well, HEB beat their rivals, Key, in that cup match.
Oh, yeah, that was a big one. Those two teams always bring the intensity when they play each other.
It's a classic rivalry, for sure. And then we had a Faroes athlete winning a medal at an international competition, which is fantastic.
Yeah, great to see. Even though we don't know the details, it's still something to celebrate.
Definitely. The Faroes women's national team lost their Euros qualifier against Spain, though.
Yeah, That's always tough, but they're a strong team, and I'm sure they'll bounce back.
And then we had the National Swimming Championships with some new records set.
Impressive. Swimming's such a demanding sport, so those records are a real testament to those athletes' dedication.
Yeah, for sure. So looking back, it seems like April was a pretty eventful month for sports in the Faroe Islands.
It really was. Lots of exciting moments, and it's inspiring to see Faroe's athletes competing at such high levels.
Yeah, it really is amazing how much can happen in just a month.
It is, and I think it really speaks to how dynamic the Faroe Islands are. They're not just sitting still.
No, definitely not. Like, it's this really interesting mix of the tradition and progress, right? You've got this new film industry emerging, but then they're also opening museums dedicated to their fishing heritage.
Exactly. They're not afraid to embrace both, the old and the new, and it makes you wonder, what did the rest of the year have in store?
That's a good question. Did they keep up that momentum? Did they prioritize that sustainable growth they were talking about? Did their cultural scene keep flourishing?
Yeah. And did those international relationships, like with Greenland, did those continue to strengthen?